They voted for dignity. They voted for fairness. They voted for sovereignty. And in 2024, against manipulation, violence, and whispers of democratic collapse, the people of Senegal forced change through the ballot box. Africa's youngest elected head of state took office not on the back of tanks, but on the weight of expectation. Voters were clear about what they wanted: lower living costs, real accountability, and jobs for a young, educated generation running out of patience. For a brief moment, Senegal felt like proof that democracy could still deliver. Then came the number no one had voted on: $13 billion. Hidden debt, a fiscal trap waiting behind the celebration. Suddenly, the promises sounded heavier. The room felt smaller, and the space to govern shrank overnight. If you want to understand why democratic hope so often collides with economic reality, not just in Senegal, but across much of Africa, stay with me, because this story is not really about politics. It's about arithmetic. And arithmetic never negotiates. Now let's step back and see what Senegal was actually trying to change. The mandate was broad, but it was also precise. Senegalese voters weren't asking for ideology. They were asking for outcomes: affordability in daily life, accountability from elites, and job creation for a generation that did everything right: studied, adapted, waited, yet found fewer doors open than their parents did. Bassirou Diomaye Faye entered office carrying that mandate, shaped by the campaign language of PASTEF: dignity, fairness, sovereignty. Dignity for youth whose education no longer guarantees opportunity. Fairness in confronting corruption and ending the sense that power operates above the law. Sovereignty in rebalancing Senegal's relationships with external actors, especially former colonial partners, to better serve national development. None of this was radical in the abstract. In fact, it echoed demands heard across democracies worldwide. What made Senegal different was the moment. This was not change after collapse or coup. It was change through insistence, citizens forcing institutions to work, but political clarity does not equal policy capacity. And promises made in moral language still have to survive economic constraints. To understand how narrow that space really was, we need to look backward at the system Senegal inherited, not the one it hoped to build. For years, Senegal was treated as a relative success story: stable, predictable, a democracy that functioned in a region where many had failed. But that surface stability masked a deeper structural reality, one built on fragile public finances and an economy that never fully formalized. Beneath the political calm sat a tax base that was always narrow. Nearly 90% of citizens worked in the informal economy, outside regular taxation, outside social protection, outside the neat models used by finance ministries and international lenders. Growth existed, but it was uneven. Aspirations rose faster than wages. Education expanded faster than employment. And then there was debt. Not the visible kind debated in parliament or scrutinized by voters, but obligations accumulated quietly, reported incompletely, and managed out of public view. When the $13 billion figure finally surfaced, it didn't just shock markets, it rewrote Senegal's recent history. Suddenly, past decisions demanded payment, credit ratings collapsed, and a government elected to expand opportunity discovered it had inherited a balance sheet designed for restraint. This is where the first real crisis begins, not with protest or collapse, but with a brutal realization. Because once debt reveals itself, it stops being abstract. It starts making demands. The revelation detonated quietly, but its impact was explosive. $13 billion in hidden debt doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with spreadsheets, downgraded credit, and closed doors. Overnight, Senegal went from democratic inspiration to fiscal cautionary tale. Investors didn't wait for explanations. They recalculated risk. Lenders hardened terms. What had been optimism turned into hesitation. And inside government, the mood shifted from celebration to triage. This was the first true test of the new leadership. Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko was blunt. Senegal, he said, would not accept the label of a failed state. Debt restructuring was framed as humiliation. The alternative? Mobilize tax revenue, pay what is owed, preserve sovereignty. On paper, it sounded resolute. In practice, it collided with reality. You cannot squeeze revenue from an economy where most people already operate outside the formal system. You cannot promise a lower cost of living while signaling higher taxes. And you cannot create jobs by alarming the very investors needed to finance growth. If you find this tension familiar, you should, because this is the moment when ideals meet constraints, and when democracies are judged not by intentions, but by trade-offs. And that brings us to the deeper question: what kind of system produces this trap in the first place? The trap isn't ideological, it's structural. Senegal didn't wake up one morning and choose contradiction. It inherited a system where political legitimacy and economic flexibility move in opposite directions. Voters demand relief, credit markets demand restraint, and the state sits in between, absorbing the pressure. Hidden debt doesn't just limit spending, it warps decision-making. Every policy becomes defensive. Every reform is judged not by its social impact, but by how lenders might react. Even sovereignty so central to PASTEF's message becomes conditional, constrained by balance sheets written years earlier. This is the mechanism most people never see. Debt turns democratic time into a countdown. Elections promise change in months. Fiscal repair takes decades. And when transparency fails, today's voters pay for yesterday's silence. Inside Senegal's leadership, this tension began to surface. Public unity masked private disagreement. How much to confront the past? How much to reassure markets? How far to push reform before confidence cracks? And outside government, suspicion spread. Someone had signed off on this. Someone had known, or should have. When trust erodes this way, debt stops being just a number. It becomes political fuel. And fuel under pressure looks for a spark. That spark came sooner than expected. The rift between Faye and Sonko began to widen. Public statements were made. Resentment bubbled beneath the surface. Sonko, once a firebrand against the system, now had to navigate the delicate balance of power. He positioned himself as the guardian of Senegal's sovereignty, opposed to debt restructuring and any policy that might stifle national pride. Faye, by contrast, was tasked with managing the inevitable economic consequences of the debt crisis, even if it meant backing down from some of the more populist promises. The new government was becoming fractured in real time, and the public was paying attention. Every disagreement, every shift in tone added fuel to the fire. In the streets, frustration was palpable. Young people who had voted for change were now staring at a future that seemed even more uncertain than before. They wanted more than just slogans. They wanted results. Results that, despite their leaders' promises, appeared increasingly out of reach. Senegal, it seemed, was walking a tightrope between the demands of its people, the needs of its economy, and the weight of an inherited fiscal disaster. The question no longer was whether the country could change. It was whether the country could survive this moment without imploding from within. What the world needs to understand is that this isn't just about Senegal. It's about an entire continent. Governments everywhere are facing similar dilemmas. They are squeezed between the demands of democracy and the constraints of debt. And in many cases, like Senegal's, the pain of that squeeze is becoming too hard to ignore. In the midst of all this internal strife, one question looms. How much longer can Senegal's democracy survive this fiscal nightmare? The social fabric, which had been so resilient in the face of electoral manipulation and political violence, now shows signs of fraying. Trust in government institutions is starting to wane. The very same youth who rallied around the promise of change now feel betrayed not just by politicians, but by the system that allowed the debt to build without their knowledge or consent. This is where Senegal's plight becomes universal. It is not merely an African issue, it's a global one. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, countries are confronting the same dilemma. how to honor democratic commitments in an age of financial reckoning, how to balance the promises of sovereignty and dignity with the cold reality of debt obligations and market expectations. The stakes are high, and the world has not yet responded in kind. While Senegal struggles to find a way forward, the international community remains largely silent on the question of debt relief. Calls for transparency and fiscal fairness are echoed, but actual solutions remain distant. Senegal's fight for financial sovereignty risks becoming a symbolic battle, one where democratic ideals are crushed under the weight of economic realities. This is the crossroads at which Senegal stands, an intersection where its fate will be decided not by the strength of its institutions, but by the strength of its people's resolve. The future of Senegal is not written in the stars. It is shaped by the choices made in these very moments. There are three possible paths ahead, each shaped by the decisions the leadership makes and the responses of its people. The best-case scenario is a cautious but thoughtful approach to economic reform. In this path, debt is renegotiated with international partners, tax reform is carried out without overwhelming the informal economy, and investment is encouraged through transparent governance. If this is achieved, Senegal could stabilize its finances, retain democratic legitimacy, and begin to build the job market it desperately needs. The middle path is one of compromise, where short-term austerity measures are reluctantly introduced. This scenario risks social unrest, but also lays the foundation for long-term fiscal recovery. It's the most painful of the three, but perhaps the most realistic if done with sensitivity to the public's expectations. The worst-case scenario, however, is one in which debt continues to spiral out of control while public trust continues to erode. In this case, political fragmentation deepens, economic growth stalls, and Senegal could find itself trapped in a cycle of debt dependency and civil unrest. The very democracy that once seemed so promising could collapse under its own weight, ushering in a period of instability. In the end, the question isn't whether Senegal can fix its debt problem. It's whether it can balance the impossible tightrope between democratic hopes and financial realities. The choices made now will determine not just the future of Senegal, but the lessons it offers to the rest of the world. This is where we must leave it for now. The final answer, as always, rests with the people.